As seen throughout history, it can be proven that protests are a beneficial way of communicating. Protests are events where people gather to publicly express their opinions about a belief or an occurrence in society. Whether they take the form of marches, boycotts, or sit-ins, these protests help communicate ideas that encourage change. In order for change to occur, it is required that multiple ideas of change have been communicated between many people. Everything will stay the same if people do not use forms of communication to express their beliefs.
For a long time, women had not been given similar opportunities and rights as men. They were belittled and men were treated as superiors. With most men having influence and them believing women were inferior, women could not communicate their ideas. The beliefs they had and the rights they wanted were not acknowledged. Protests really changed this, though. These protests became a form of communication for women. When they protested, they were able to make their voices heard. If a protest occurred and had a huge crowd, people would end up hearing about it from all over, therefore exposing themselves to the protesters' ideas. Women who started protesting in one city would then end up communicating their ideas with women and men in other cities, leading to an increase in protests for their cause. The fight for women's rights would gain recognition due to these protests. Without this form of communication, only a small amount of people would be exposed to these ideas and this fight for change.
The day before the inauguration of President-elect Woodrow Wilson, a parade occurred that was fighting for women's suffrage. For many years, women had been trying to communicate the idea that they wanted the right to vote. They believed that as citizens who were affected by the results of these political elections, they deserved to have a say in the outcome. For all these years, their voices were ignored, for most men believed that they did not deserve to have a say. It is safe to say that these women did not have a very good form of communication that would lead to their beliefs being expressed all over. The use of protests and parades definitely changed this for the better. Because of protests like the Women's Suffrage Parade in 1913, women's voices were heard louder than they had been in the past. This parade was a form of communication because it helped communicate with others the ideas that these men and women had. These people were marching for women's suffrage, and through the use of signs and their voices, they made it known to all those around them that they really wanted women to have the right to vote. And due to the timing of this parade, a large audience was exposed to what these men and women marching were trying to communicate. Many people had been in town to witness the inauguration, and during their visit were met by these marchers expressing ideas. And not only did this parade communicate these ideas with those who were there to witness it, but it would later lead to news stories and congressional hearings, which would expose more people with these ideas. Because of these protests, they had found a whole new way of communicating that would benefit them greatly. This parade was claimed by many to have given the suffrage movement a new sense of purpose and inspiration. And although women did not earn the right to vote until 7 years later, this protest had a huge impact on making the suffrage movement known. And it led to many more having support when it came to giving women the right to vote. Many were still against it, but this protest had persuaded many others to pay more attention to this movement.
The time where communication in the form of protest was shown was in 1970. On August 26, 1970, 50 years after the ratification of the 19th Amendment permitting women the right to vote, 50,000 women feminists came together at New York City's Fifth Avenue fighting for more rights. The Women's Strike for Equality March was sponsored by the National Organization for Women, also known as the NOW, and was organized by Betty Friedman. Friedman's original idea was for a national workday stoppage, where women would stop the cooking and cleaning, which would showcase the unequal distribution of domestic labor. The turnout of this event was soon much larger than she imagined, due to the spread of people communicating. Protesters carried signs which said, "Don't iron while the strike is hot," and "Don't cook dinner. Starve a rat today." New York City was not the only city that had protests. The word spread, and there were sister marches in 90 cities and 42 states. These marches consisted of three major topics: free abortion on demand, equal opportunity in education and employment, and the establishment of 24/7 child care centers. In Los Angeles, there was a smaller protest with hundreds of women who stood holding vigils for women's rights. In Washington, D.C., women marched on Connecticut Avenue and lobbied for their equal rights, collecting more than 1,500 signatures to present to the government. The women's strike for equality was a great accomplishment, and communication was a key factor in its success. Through the protests and marches, the feminist movement was more recognized, and the National Organization for Women's membership grew by 50%. It had nationwide attention and made the front page of national newspapers such as the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and Chicago Tribune. Additionally, the movement succeeded in the passage of Title IX in 1972, which forbade sex discrimination in any educational program, and Congress legalized abortion in all 50 states, but it was limited.
Fight for women's rights did not just end after changes had been made due to previous protests. Older generations continued to communicate with younger generations and made sure they knew that they should continue the fight for change. And it is evident that this worked because years after these protests, people continued to spread the word about women's rights and eventually changes were made. The Women's March in 2017 was yet another protest that communicated the idea that women deserve more rights. This protest that occurred in January was the largest single-day protest in the United States history. It was estimated that 3 to 5 million women participated in this protest, communicating about how women deserved rights. The news coverage of this event eventually led to many changes being enforced, which proves just how much protests can communicate ideas and lead to change.
In general, these protests communicated the ideas of the women marching in them. It expressed their distress and disbelief of how women were not given certain rights. By expressing these thoughts, they communicated with others. They appealed to other women around the world who heard about their ideas, and these marches made it clear to men and officials that changes needed to be made. Without this form of communication, women would not have had a way of expressing their ideas to people who had influence, and changes would not be made.